Let me just quickly pray before I start and just say, Lord, may the words of my mouth and may the meditations and reflections of our hearts be pleasing to you. Will you guide and steer us in this part of the service, that we may know you better, ourselves more deeply, and be able to follow you more clearly. Amen. Well, I thought I might break with tradition and we might start the talk before we've had the reading. And there's a sort of a reason for that, which is actually, before we get to sort of the passage that we're going to be exploring about today, we actually need to really understand the bit of the passage that's been leading up to it, because we can't really understand it in isolation. And so what we're going to do today is I'm just going to explain and explore a little bit about what's happened, partly from where Dan left off last week, because we're focusing as we continue to explore the book of Mark and what the Mark is trying to communicate to his readers and also to us via his Spirit. And then we're going to read the passage, and I'm going to explain and talk a little bit about what that passage seems to be saying to me and what I've learned as I've been looking at that passage. And then during the reflection time, we're then actually I'm going to read the passage again, but do it more as a reflection reading. And I'll break that reading and ask some questions as we read that and reflect that together and maybe see what God might be saying to us as a church and also to you individually. So kind of that's where I'm hoping this part of the service will go. So my name is Paul, and I'm a member of the congregation here at St James's by the Park. And for those that have been tracking with Mark and following our series, we all know that Dan finished last week with looking at a healing, which was quite an unusual healing that Mark records, where Jesus needed to heal the blind person twice. And he reflected on how that is kind of a symbolic way that Mark's included that story as a way of trying to illustrate that actually a little bit later, Peter is able to declare and say who Jesus was, because the whole part of the first bit of Mark was all about who is Jesus. And Mark reveals the person of who Jesus is through the signs, the miracles, and things like that. And then Peter declares, "Oh, you're the Messiah. I understand who you are." But then gets it a bit misunderstood about what it means to follow Jesus, what type of Messiah Jesus was. And that's what Mark was trying to reveal by this two-stage healing. And then we enter this sort of middle section of Mark that's bookended by two healings of a blind person. The first one that Dan covered last week, and then the one that we're going to look at later. And everything that happens in between those two sections for Mark is kind of like Mark's trying to highlight to the people that will be listening to this Gospel of Mark that actually what happens here between these two things is related. And he often uses that. In other parts of Mark, he will split a story in two and throw something in the middle of it in order to try and highlight that all of these things are related. They're trying to communicate the same thing. And that's what we're going to get now. And actually, the thing that I think Mark's trying to communicate to us is really this bit. If we know who Jesus is, if we've had that first sight, that first awareness of Jesus being the Messiah, what's then stopping us from fully following Jesus? And that's what this whole section is about. Because what happens in this section? Well, in this section, first of all, there's that first blind healing just outside the Lake of Galilee. I know it's a little bit small, but it's there. And then the disciples and Jesus travel even further north, quite away from Israel, really into the wilderness, really, from Israeli or an Israelite perspective at the time, up until there. And that's where Caesarea Philippi at the top. And that's where Peter declares Jesus the Messiah. And then the whole thing shifts. Up to now, Jesus and his disciples have been kind of wandering around a little bit, sort of looping around, but all really around the Sea of Galilee. That's the geography that Mark's using here to tell his story, up a little bit up in the wilderness. But as soon as Peter has that declaration, The disciples in the story, in the geography, the disciples and Jesus make a straight line down to Jericho, where the other dot is, on their way to Jerusalem. And so this section of the Bible, Mark's Gospel, is known as the Way, because Jesus is teaching and talking on the way. I think Paul might have mentioned this on the very first introduction to Mark. And it's not a coincidence that this next thing happens at the town of Jericho, because Mark also uses some of the language of the Israelites. And when the Israelites crossed the sea of the Dead Sea, when they were escaping from Egypt, they then walked through the Dead Sea, and that was symbolized by Jesus' baptism, by John. And then Jesus went out into the wilderness, and they've kind of been in a bit of the wilderness at the moment, up north, but now they're coming straight down into the political center and the religious center of Israel, which is just like actually where the disciples, after wandering around the desert for 40 years, then came across, and what was the first, for some of you that might know the story, the first town that the Israelites took as part of creating the new Israel was Jericho. So this isn't an accident that these sort of things happen. This is actually part of Mark telling the story and highlighting the fact that what Jesus is doing is creating a new Israel, a new people that are going to be able to follow and follow God in the way that the Israelites weren't quite able to do and hadn't done fully. But Jesus is the only one who can do it fully. And that's kind of what that map is, and that's what the story is, and that's why the things happen at Jericho. But what happens on that way? Well, I've said we had the first healing of the man at Bethsaida. We then got Peter's declaration of Jesus. We then got Jesus then foretelling about the fact that he's going to die, but he invites his followers to come and follow him. And that's where Peter sort of says, "Oh, no, you're not. That's not going to happen. What we're going to do it this other way." And Dan spoke all about that last week, so do listen to that. But then what happens? Well, a father has his son, and his disciples can't heal him, and the father asks Jesus for faith because he questions a bit, and then he says to Jesus, "Lord, give me the faith. Help me have faith." And then Jesus foretells his death a second time on this way down. And then the disciples argue, who's the greatest? I think I might be the greatest. And they argue about who's the greatest disciple. But Jesus then turns that round and blesses the children. And then what happens? We then have an encounter with a rich young man who wants to ask, how do I get eternal life? And Jesus challenges him and says, "Well, give up everything, all your riches, and follow me." And the rich young man wasn't able to do that. And Jesus foretells his death a third time. You kind of get the rhythm that Mark's kind of using here to try and build and make us aware. And then we get the request of James and John, where James and John are then saying, actually, Jesus sort of on the side, when you're in glory, can we be on your right and your left? Can we have authority? Can we have authority and power and be respected by everybody else, just as you have? And then we get this healing of blind Bartimaeus at the end. And that's what we're going to explore. So we've had all of these different things. People kind of wanting to follow, but not quite getting and understanding the message of what Jesus is trying to say. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And what are some of the barriers that people have put in place? So, with that background, I'm going to read now the story, which is from Mark 10 and from verses 46. So if you've got a Bible or a Bible app, it's worth having a look at it as I'm going to sort of then explore that later on. And you might also want it in front of you as you look through the passage as we do the reflection bit afterwards. So it says, Mark says, "They came to Jericho as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood and said, "Call him here." And they called him, the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. So it's a short passage, but it's absolutely packed full of meaning and significance. I've talked a bit about Jericho, and I'm just going to draw out some of the other things that really stood out to me. The first thing that's actually really quite unusual for this healing story is that Mark gives us Bartimaeus' name. In all of a lot of the other healings, we never know who the names of anybody else. Jesus just heals them. And that's kind of a bit like if you were having a film, if you were watching this as a film, the camera focus up to now has been on Jesus, because the question that Mark's been looking at and trying to help people understand is who Jesus is. So actually the focus is on Jesus. But when we come to this healing, the camera has changed its focus, and it's now focusing and pointing to Bartimaeus. Mark wants us to actually start to understand and look and focus on actually who Bartimaeus is and what Bartimaeus is doing, rather than actually what Jesus is doing. And I think he's wanting to do that because actually, as we explore this passage, we see that for Mark, Bartimaeus is the true an example of what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to be a disciple. And so he's using this as a way of trying to really make that clear to us. What we also find out here later on in verse 47, it's that he began to shout and say, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And that's unusual a bit as well, in the sense that he was declaring who Jesus was as the Messiah, just like Peter was. So he had like that first sight, that first understanding of who Jesus was. And he shouted out, and he made it known. When he was there in this place, he didn't necessarily know where Jesus was, so he had to shout out and call out. The blindness was stopping him from being able to come to Jesus. If we remember, the woman that was healed from bleeding was able to go up to Jesus and just touch his cloak. You know, she could see, she could understand the way to go, whereas blind Bartimaeus was unable to do that. Also, in this section, we see that the crowds are crying out again to him, "Oh, be quiet. You know, he's not interested in you." And again, you know, that's just what happened earlier in the story. When the children were coming to Jesus, the disciples and the crowds were trying to keep them away, and Jesus said, "No, let them come." And yet we see again in this story that Mark's still using that idea and that understanding that actually, yes, these disciples are still, and the crowd are still trying to block the vulnerable and the people that are unable to access Jesus, still trying to keep them away, thinking that Jesus is too important for them. But Jesus stops and hears and calls them and says, "Come here," and calls him, just like he called the disciples at the very start. And what did Bartimaeus have to do? He got up and he had to leave his cloak behind, just like the disciples, when Jesus called them, left their nets behind. But he called them. And some commentators have sort of mentioned about that leaving of the cloak is a bit like leaving his income. He was a beggar, as it said at the start. And so as he was when he was begging, he would have laid his cloak out in front of him for people to throw money on. So actually the getting up and the leaving the cloak is a bit like getting up and leaving that money, the income that he was having, in order to walk towards and to talk with Jesus. And Jesus then asks, "What do you want?" And this is exactly the same phrase that Jesus asked when James and John came to him. And they said, "Oh, we want to ask you something." And Jesus said, "Yeah, what do you want?" And Jesus is using the same words now. This isn't an accident that he's doing this. But what does Bartimaeus ask for? We know that he's a poor beggar. So maybe, like the rich young man, actually he wants riches. But he doesn't ask for riches. He asks for his sight. The thing that was stopping him from being able to see Jesus, to be aware of what Jesus was doing, that's what he's asking for. He's not asking for authority. He's not asking for praise in the same way that James and John were looking for. He wasn't looking for glory for himself. He was looking to be able to restore his sight. I love the fact also that Jesus asks, "What do you want?" Jesus already knew what he wanted, but actually there's something really important, and how Jesus engages both with Bartimaeus here, but also with us as we are aware and meet with Jesus now. Jesus offers dignity. He offers agency to people, especially to people who have felt that they've had that robbed away from them through society. That's what he offers. But yes, Bartimaeus says, actually, yeah, I want my sight healing. There's no if you're willing, or there's no if you're able. There was no questioning, a bit like the father at the start of that section, who was then asking for faith. Bartimaeus knows. And so Jesus says, "Go. Your faith." But Jesus again doesn't say, "Come follow me," doesn't tell Bartimaeus what to do. He says, "Go." And again, that sense of actual freedom. I think if we feel, and we're in a place where we feel that following Jesus is a very burden and a very thing, or you think that where Jesus is calling you to do is you're not free to choose, I think we need to question that quite deeply, because often, and it says throughout the Bible, Jesus has come to give us freedom and freedom to live. And actually some of that is about that awareness that God is with us where we're going, where we're living, who we're being with. And let's allow that freedom to speak to us. God offers us freedom. But Jesus had said earlier, had offered to people, "Come, follow me." And so Bartimaeus took him up on that offer that Jesus had made at the start of this section, "Come, follow me." And then Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well, has healed you." And for me, this is one part of the story that I've actually really quite struggled with a bit. I've been praying for the last 6-9 months for healing for a situation. And I'm not seeing God heal. Is that my lack of faith? Is that what's going on? I don't think that that's the case. And I'm just exploring this, what's happening at the moment for me and my understanding a bit of healing. And I'm a beginner on that journey, and I'd welcome people to share their thoughts and reflections to me on this as well. But for me, what I've seen, and I look in the gospel messages, and as we've looked at Mark, the healing that Jesus performs here enables the person to be able to follow. When somebody in one of the other gospel stories lowers a paralytic man through the roof of somebody's house, Jesus, as we know, those that know the story, Jesus first says, your sins are forgiven. And then later on, then says, you're healed, get up and walk. But that was almost like, that's not the important thing. The important thing was your sins are forgiven. Because actually for him, the sins was stopping him from being able to follow Christ's leading. I was challenged in my thinking of healing a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, when I was talking with somebody, and they had walked with crutches for most of their life during their youth, and they had really wrestled with the fact that they had been asking for healing, and it was not happening. But he then said he then received healing. And actually the healing that he got was not a physical healing that meant he could walk around and jump. He still used crutches. But what he was healed from was that sense in which the crutches and his illness was a barrier to him following Christ. And what they became actually was an avenue in which he was able to give grace and help others to be able to also follow Christ. So it stopped being a barrier. He still had them, but they weren't the barrier that stopped him from following Christ. And I think that's part of our understanding of healing needs to be. It's actually sometimes, am I saying we should never pray for physical healing? No, I think it's good to do that. But actually, often, it's what's really going on is where is that actually a barrier to where Christ is leading you? Sometimes, actually, illness and other things are a way in which we are to follow Christ and see what Christ is actually trying to teach us and help us with in that time, in that place of difficulty as we struggle with that illness. But other times, God is gracious and does heal. So I'm still learning on this path. What I think Mark is trying to say here in this is that Jesus has the power and the authority to heal, both physically and also to heal so that we can see the way forward to follow Christ, and empowers us to be able to do that. What Mark isn't saying is blind people can't follow Jesus. It's a way of a story of trying to really illustrate what we mean and how we live and work as we follow Jesus. And so unlike Peter, who wanted to lead Jesus and be able to tell Jesus where to go, Bartimaeus doesn't. Bartimaeus just follows and follows the way, follows where Jesus goes. To Mark, like us, and we know where Jesus is going, and Mark's readers would have known where Jesus was going. And Mark's trying to encourage us to continue to follow, even though maybe the path ahead might be difficult. Because our way of following Jesus will require aspects of us to be able to die along with Jesus and to be resurrected, to understand a new life, understand the life that actually God has originally created us and made us to be more fully alive with him. So, what have we seen in this story? A father who lacked faith and asked Jesus for faith. We see Bartimaeus has faith. Peter, who was unwilling to follow, we see Bartimaeus followed. We see that the disciples who wanted to be great, they were also trying to discourage other people that were doing miracles in Jesus' name from doing them because they weren't part of their club. They wanted to be the greatest, or they wanted to have places of honor and glory. But Bartimaeus wanted to be able to see the way. The rich young man was unwilling to become poor, but Bartimaeus was poor and not wanting to get rich. He wanted to follow. So in all of this, what Mark is doing is he's trying to provide where the disciples have not had that second healing, that opening of their eyes to be able to see what it means to follow Jesus. Mark's providing a character, a side character, a member of the crowd, somebody who was kind of there, aware, but not special in that sense, to actually become the example of what discipleship means. So now I've sort of talked a little bit and talked about some of the things that have been highlighted for me. We just want to read that passage again. And I think as I read it, this will be sort of a part of a reflection. For some people, this may really help. For other people, it may feel uncomfortable. For other people, they may not work, and in which case, please just read the passage in front of you and continue to think about what God might be saying to you through the passage. But I'm going to read the story and allow us to imagine ourselves in that story. And at different times, I'm actually going to ask us some questions that may resonate with you. And maybe that's where you want to stop, actually. And as I carry on reading, you might want to just stop in that place and continue to reflect on that question. So let us just stretch a little bit. Let's move around. You've been sitting for a bit. And take a moment to get comfortable. Some people might want to follow the passage being read. Other people might want to just close their eyes and listen. But I will encourage you to imagine yourself in this scene, maybe as Bartimaeus. Allow your imagination to explore what it might have sounded like, what it might have smelt like, or what the weather was like. How did you feel that sun on your skin? Jesus came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. He heard the noise, the shouts of people as they were going by, and he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth. So he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. "Shush!" But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." I wonder if some of us can recognize that experience, where others have communicated by their words or their actions that you are not important enough for God. But maybe unlike Bartimaeus, has your cry become quieter because of this? And so that moment, that encounter with God walked by. But Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called to the blind man, saying, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" How might you respond to this question today? What would you like Jesus to do for you? What is it that you feel is a barrier for you in seeing and following the way of Jesus in your life at the moment? Bartimaeus left his cloak. Is there anything you need to leave behind? Is it a sense of inadequacy? Is it some unrighteous anger? What is it that we hold on to? The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. I wonder what it was like for Bartimaeus. For the first thing that he sees for such a long time is Jesus looking at him. I wonder what Jesus' eyes and face will be saying to him. What if Jesus was looking at you this morning? Looking at you with gentleness, with strength and love in the way that a dear and deep friend might. And Jesus did not command Bartimaeus to follow him. He was free to choose. What is your response to Jesus' invitation at this moment? I'll invite the band to come back up as we start to sing our next song, which is Second Chance. And that's where we come before Christ. There may have been times where we might have felt that we've missed something, but actually there's always a second chance with Jesus. Jesus is free to let us make our choices. Sometimes we do choose not to follow, but there's always a second chance, always a welcome and a hand and a willingness to be with us, steer and guide us, and to walk with us as we follow.